Thank you everyone for joining us today for our learning session, Conserving Tropical Forests by Understanding, Valuing, and Monetizing Their Services to Development Goals, organized by WWF Forest and Climate. Thank you all for taking the time to join us and for your patience with our international connectivity issues. My name is Emmeline Gasparini, and I am the Program Associate with the Forest and Climate team. And our presenter today is Jonah Bush from the Center for Global Development. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few logistics and some frequently asked questions. For those of you who have participated in past sessions, this will sound familiar, but yes, today's presentation is being recorded, and you can find the recording within a few days on our YouTube channel. To get to the recording, simply go to youtube.com and search for WWF Forest and Climate. There are two audio options. You can listen through your computer or dial in through the phone number that was provided in your registration email. It's important to note that if you experience audio difficulties while listening through your computer, those are sometimes caused by having too many browser windows or programs open at once, so feel free to close some of them, which usually solves the issue, or you're always welcome to join by phone. And if you continue to have technical difficulties, please send me a message via the chat area and I'll try to get you all sorted out. Questions are absolutely welcome. You can send your questions anytime during the webinar using the toolbar on your screen, and we'll answer as many as possible during our allotted time. After the webinar, you'll receive a link in your follow-up email with additional resources from WWF, including a link to the YouTube channel where you can watch a recording of the session. Thank you again for joining us, and with that, we'll get started. Jonah, why don't you take us away?
Thanks, Emmeline. Next slide, please. Is the slide up yet that says Conserving
Yes.
Tropical Forests?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, it is. Okay. All right. I'm not seeing it on mine, so I'll just. Oh, there it is. Okay. Thank you. So thanks everyone for joining. This talk is about one way of conserving tropical forests, which is to understand, to value, and to monetize their services to development goals. By that I mean goals related to food, to water, to energy, to health, to human safety and poverty reduction, in addition to climate and biodiversity. And as I'll explain, precisely quantifying these services' economic value is often challenging. And initiatives to make forests worth more alive than dead by monetizing their services have had some successes, but have not reversed the tide of tropical deforestation. By that I mean things like non-timber forest products, ecotourism, bioprospecting, payments for ecosystem services. And there's some good reasons to think that some of the constraints on valuing and monetizing forest services don't apply to climate services and international carbon payments, although these have faced some different challenges of their own. And of course, values to sustainable development are only one motivation for conserving forests, and monetizing their service values is only one method for doing so. So I'll close the talk with some reflections on why and how to conserve forests this way and how that fits with other reasons and methods for conserving forests. Next slide, please. So this, I'll just. So
we can see
does that come up?
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, I can't. All right, I think I've got a long lag, but I'll just assume when I say next, it goes to the next.
Perfect.
Okay, so this talk is based on two chapters from a new book called Why Forests, Why Now, that I wrote with Francis Seymour. It's about tropical forests and climate change, and it covers the science, economics, and politics. We wrote this book because we wanted to have an authoritative volume on tropical forests, and we wanted to make it accessible to a non-specialist audience, people who may not be forest experts like yourselves, but I hope that you guys will still find this interesting. And we wanted the book to be persuasive. We wanted it to make the case for greater support from rich countries for tropical forests, especially through performance-based payments. So we commissioned about 20 background papers from topical experts that fed into this book, including two that these chapters draw from, one by Katrina Brandon on the science of ecosystem services, one by Katrina Mullen on the economics of ecosystem services. This talk is going to be very broad but very shallow. I'm not going to be able to get into the individual topics in great depth, and I may leave out some nuance that is there in the book. Most of these topics, as you'll see, could be entire books or webinars on their own. So next slide. Tropical deforestation, many of you are probably familiar, looks like this. The big green regions in the center of the planet are the large forests of the Amazon, the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia. The red that you see there is deforestation, mostly for cattle pasture and soy in Latin America, for small-scale farming in Africa, and the purple there in Southeast Asia is conversion of natural forests to other kinds of trees, oil palm, and fast-growing pulp and paper species. And this adds up to an area in the tropics of about the size of Austria or Maine every year that's deforested. Next slide, please. So interest in preventing this deforestation in the tropics goes way back, starting, I would say, with interest in biodiversity loss, as you see with the World Wildlife Fund panda logo there. And more in recent decades, interest in preventing climate change. So that Austria-sized area of forest loss is a lot of carbon that was in the trees and gets burned and goes to the atmosphere. If you added all that up, it's the third largest country, more climate emissions than every country except China or the US. So we can't solve climate change without addressing tropical deforestation. There's a third reason, which has to do with the benefits that forests provide to the people who live around them, contributions to better health, more electricity, and so forth, which are nicely encapsulated in these Sustainable Development Goals agreed by world leaders in 2015. Next slide, please. So what are some of these services that forests provide? And then next slide, again, the one with the clean water and sanitation logo. So if you think about tropical forests, they are dense. They're packed with vegetation. The trees at many, many heights are stacked. You could think of them like umbrellas. And so violent tropical rainstorms are softened by these stacks of umbrellas. So when the rain falls, it slows to a trickle by the time it hits the ground. There's litter shielding the soil. There's roots holding the soil in place, even on very steep slopes. And there's a diverse array of plants and animals removing pollutants. And so what this all means is that water that flows through the tropical forest is clean, and it contains less sediment than water flowing off of a deforested landscape where the soil is exposed, often compacted, and there the rain strikes harder, leading to erosion and sediment runoff. So the value of this clean water is it's used for drinking, it's used for cooking, it's used in irrigation. One of the most interesting things I found is about feeding hydroelectric dams. More on this later. Next slide, please. Forests also contribute to food. You might think about forests being cleared for soy or beef or other food, but even the standing forests in their own right contribute to agriculture. We mentioned irrigation already. but also through pollination, through insectivores that eat pests, by creating favorable weather downwind, and even watering bread baskets at long distances. But one of the most interesting ways forests contribute to food is coastal mangrove forests are breeding grounds and nurseries for marine fish. They have lots of nutrients, and the tangled root systems of mangroves shelter the fish that live between them from strong waves. And they keep the little fish safe from predators until they've grown big enough to leave. And it's estimated that the commercial fish catch that relies on mangroves at some stage of their life cycle is around 30% in Southeast Asia and 60% in India. That's coming from the source at the bottom here. You can see some of these slides have see alsos to find out more about a topic. Next slide, please. So forests also contribute to better health. One of the ways they do that is by suppressing malarial mosquitoes. So comparing forests to cleared areas, forests have cooler temperatures, they have less standing water, which leads to slower breeding of mosquitoes. There's also more insectivores around to eat the mosquitoes, and there's more competition for the ecological niche filled by mosquitoes. All this adds up to less malaria transmission. The point of this in the last few slides is not to say that forests always do it better, that the forest would be the best way to prevent malaria relative to bed nets or vaccination campaigns or other things you could be doing. Rather, that protecting forests for their climate services has many important co-benefits, of which this is one. Co-benefits that you wouldn't necessarily get with other ways to slow climate change. But it does bring up an interesting question, which is when would you want to protect forests as a way to achieve these development goals, or either instead of or alongside other things you could be doing. So one way to answer that question is to try to put a dollar figure, a value, on the service that's being provided by the forest. So next slide, please. I'll give some examples of that. So as I mentioned earlier, forested upstream watersheds keep sediment out of reservoirs behind hydroelectric dams. This helps the dam produce electricity in two ways. First, it increases the generating capacity when you have clean water flowing through instead of muddy water. It also avoids costly repairs of turbine blades that can be worn down by sediment or dredging the reservoir to remove sediment. So there have been several studies of just how much certain dams around the world benefit from having forests above their watersheds. One of them was a study by Zhongwei Guo of the Three Gorges Dam, looking at the 3 forested counties above the dam, finding that these forests contributed 6% of the dam's reservoir revenue, in 2004. $20 million a year from increased electricity in the dry season, $15 million a year from avoided costs of removing sediment, out of a total revenue that year of $600 million. And since 2004, the number of turbines has increased from 10 to 32, so the benefits are even larger now. In Latin America, 2/3 of electricity comes from hydroelectricity, and in Colombia, 3/4 of electricity comes from hydroelectricity. So Leonardo Sands and co-authors looked at one dam, the Colima Dam, where forest in the watershed above the dam has been reduced over the decades from 90% to 54%. And he and his co-authors looked at what would happen if the forests were restored back to the original 90%. He put together a variety of sophisticated models and estimated that water flow and power generation and net revenue would all increase by about 4 to 6%, which adds up to about $300 per hectare per year, which is probably more than competitive with cattle and maybe starts to get competitive with coffee. All right, next slide, please. So communities that live in and around tropical forests collect from the forest many goods. These include food products, firewood, charcoal, medicines, resins, dyes. And according to one very large global comparative study by the Center for International Forestry Research of more than 20 countries, the average income that communities in and around forests get from forests is about 21%, about more than a fifth of their income, which is comparable to what they get from agriculture. And that's not even including timber, which adds another 7%. To give an example of this, in Makira National Park in northeast Madagascar, a park about the size of Rhode Island, there are about 140,000 people living in and around the park. Epidemiologist Chris Golden documented that the people living there use 241 species to treat 82 types of illnesses. Sometimes they prefer the species from the forest to the pharmaceuticals they could get from a clinic. Sometimes they prefer the clinic medicines. But if they had to purchase the same course of treatment in the clinic that they currently get from the forests, that would be about $30 to $45 per household per year. And that's at highly subsidized rates. If they had to pay U.S. prices, it would be around $100 to $300 a year, what they're gathering now from the forest. Now, you know, $30, $45, $100, $300 a year, it may not sound like that much, but according to the study, the median household cash income there is less than $100 a year. So this is an example that forest goods and services disproportionately benefit people who are poor, generally who's living in remote forested areas. In contrast, the agriculture or ranching that displaces forest may benefit poor people the most, or it may not. But the next slide, please. So those values of forests were relatively small in absolute terms, although large in relative terms, as I said. But some values are unquestionably very, very large. One of these is the damage caused by forest fires in Indonesia. So many of you know in Indonesia that forest is cleared by burning. There's very deep and carbon-rich peat soils that catch on fire and are difficult to extinguish. And every few years there are very, very severe fires, often during the El Nino years. And the fires cause what's caused a haze that can spread across the entire region: Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Brunei, even Philippines and Vietnam. And so there have been a few studies to try to quantify the damage caused by this burning. In 1997, Tim Jessup and David Glover estimate about $4 billion in damages, mostly from lost agriculture, lost timber, lost tourism, closed airlines, closed schools, and so forth. In 2015, there were again very severe fires in Indonesia. the World Bank estimated damage of $16 billion a year. If all that land were planted in palm oil, the palm oil would not exceed $8 billion in revenue. So it's very severe damage. These are a few examples where researchers have come up with numbers of the benefits of forests or the damages from deforestation. But in general, there are some challenges to trying to quantify in dollar terms these values. The most fundamental is that the services are non-marketed. You can't buy storm protection in a store. You can't buy some of these other things in a store. So you can't just look receipts of how much people are spending in markets. You have to look at how changes in these services affect marketed goods that people do spend money on, and that can be tricky. Often the chain of cause and effect is quite complex. So the example before about how much forest leads in Colombia leads to how much water, leads to how much dam production. That takes some pretty sophisticated modeling. The values can depend on whether there are people living nearby to capture the services or not. So if there are more people living nearby to drink clean water from a forest, the value is higher. If nobody's living there, then that value is effectively zero. And the values fluctuate across space and time. So the fires in Indonesia, if they're blowing onto a big city, are going to be very damaging in dollar terms. If they're blowing out to sea where nobody lives, they're much less damaging. Next slide, please. One of the biggest challenges is that the benefits from forests, from these services, are often dispersed very widely across beneficiaries, or they occur somewhat infrequently. This is in contrast to the benefits from harvesting timber or converting land to agriculture, which are quite concentrated in private hands. And so that motivates several decades worth of efforts to try to make forests worth more alive than dead. That is, to try to get some form of concentrated economic benefits into the hands of the people who are deciding whether to keep forests standing or clear them. Next slide, please. So one of the most logical places to start with this was with certified sustainable timber, meaning sustainable meaning that valuable commercial species are growing back at roughly the same pace they're being harvested, and that you could sell that timber at a premium to ecologically minded consumers. So there's been a lot of growth in certified timber. An area worldwide about the size of Indonesia is certified, but considerably less than 10% of this is in the tropics, maybe even less than 5%, mostly outside the tropics. That's because of very demanding requirements and high costs of certification. And in fact, it is quite hotly disputed, as we found, whether sustainable management is possible for tropical forests for more than a few harvest cycles. There have been 2 review studies here of sustainable timber, finding that price premiums have largely failed to materialize. They do find benefits around increased awareness, learning, reputation, and so forth. And I should add as an aside, it does seem that punishing companies that have unsustainable practices through market pressure or fear of reputational damage can be more effective than trying to reward the companies that have sustainable practices with market premiums. Next slide. Another method for making forests worth more alive than dead is non-timber forest products, meaning expanding the market for forest goods from local subsistence consumption to consumers more broadly. The idea is that income from these goods could compete with conventional logging or agricultural conversion, or at least provide enough income for dignified livelihoods. It's been tried with seeds, flowers, fruits, leaves, roots, bark, resins, and more. And there are some boutique successes. So one example is shea nuts from West Africa used in cosmetics. But for the most part, non-timber forest products have one of two opposing fates. Either they have failed to take off due to market barriers or competition from plantation products, or they're victims of their own success, leading to overexploitation of the product in the wild. Next slide, please. What about medicines? So it's not just the local traditional medicines like I mentioned for Makira and Madagascar, it's also modern pharmaceuticals, which are a $300 billion a year industry. These also come from forests. Out of about 1,000 or so chemicals approved every year by the Food and Drug Administration, or sorry, 1,000 chemicals approved total, I suppose, that can't be every year. 70% have biological origins, and many of these are undoubtedly tropical plants. Perhaps the most famous are vinblastin and vincristin, which treat many forms of cancer and come from the rosy periwinkle in Madagascar. But some of the others are quinine for malaria, which comes from the Peruvian Andes, a tree there, tubocucarine, muscle relaxant from the Amazonian liana, and progesterone and birth control comes from Mexican wild yams. But there are some barriers to turning these very valuable and lucrative drugs into monetized income for forest countries and communities. So one of them is that once the drugs are discovered, generally there's no need anymore to conserve the original forest if the drugs can be produced in greenhouses or synthesized in the lab. And again, some of the ones that do have to be collected from the wild are threatened with extinction due to overharvesting. And forests are open access, generally, meaning that has been in the past easy for drug companies to go in, take plants without compensation to the countries, something the forest countries call biopiracy, and this is intended to be addressed by the Nagoya Protocol of the Center for the Convention on Biological Diversity, access and benefit sharing provisions. And there's diminishing returns. So each successive discovery of a certain type reduces the value of additional plants with the same property. Next slide, please. So ecotourism helps protect many forests. There are less than 1,000 mountain gorillas left in the wild, and if you want to get up close with them, you can go to Virunga in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and you pay $400 a day for a ticket. And then there's also all the money that's spent on hotels, on restaurants, transportation, souvenirs, and so forth. So in places like Virunga, tourism is very helpful in making the forest worth more alive than dead. But demand is limited. Most forests are not Virunga. They don't have gorillas that are easy to see. And most people won't make that many trips to a tropical forest in their lifetime. Many won't make any at all. So for 20 million square kilometers of tropical forest, there's a whole lot of that where tourism is not a viable strategy. Next slide, please. And finally, of this list of ways to make forests worth more alive than dead, payments for ecosystem services, the red box here is around the entire list, because instead of trying to monetize one particular service, the idea is to pay for the existence of forests with all their services. Often clean water is a primary motivation, but it's other things here too. First, Here, often the government pays landholders directly for maintaining or for restoring each hectare of forest cover or for signing a contract to do so. Used first in Costa Rica, expanded to Mexico, Vietnam, Ecuador, and elsewhere. These payments for ecosystem services come in a variety of forms. The programs have made different decisions with regards to targeting the payments, with differentiating the prices and other technical aspects. And there is evidence that where tried, payments for ecosystem services can reduce deforestation, although that's not universally found in all studies. So the Achilles heel with payments for ecosystem services, though, is unclear land rights across much of the tropics. So unclear who would be the natural recipient for money. And so because of this, there are many places across the tropics where payment for ecosystem services hasn't been tried or would be difficult to try. Next slide, please. So the question we asked in our book is, can international carbon payments succeed where some of these previous attempts to make forests worth more alive than dead have fallen short? And there's some good reasons to think that they can. So first, a brief overview of REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation. It may be a review for many of you. The concept is that rich countries pay tropical forest countries for keeping their forests standing, monitored by satellite and funded by either carbon markets or public funds. And the motivation for the rich countries doing so is that it's generally a cheaper and faster way to be addressing climate change than some of the other options. So after 10 years of negotiation on technical issues, REDD+ entered the Paris Agreement as a centerpiece of the agreement. So there's political consensus now, political agreement. So carbon has some favorable qualities that make it easier to value than some of the other services. So the chain of cause and effect is very straightforward. If you burn the trees, the carbon goes up to the atmosphere. So if you know how much carbon was in the trees, you know exactly how much damage happened to the atmosphere. It's relatively easy to measure carbon stocks compared to something like, let's say, change in malaria incidents from deforestation. And if you know that every ton of carbon counts equally, whether it's the first ton of carbon burned or the millionth, whether the carbon is very remote or near a town, the value is the same if it's burned today or burned yesterday. So all these properties make it pretty easy to get a handle on the value of forests for for a stable climate. And it is also easier to potentially monetize the services from climate than it is for some of these other services. So one of the reasons is that potentially there could be nearly unlimited demand for a stable climate. We could globally halt all deforestation and restore tropical forests, and we would still have appetite to do more on climate change. So the demand for a stable climate could potentially be much, very, very large compared to these other things like ecotourism. Carbon payments have the potential to influence underlying national policies and not just local conditions. And there's no diminishing marginal returns. So if you store carbon in your forest, that doesn't in any way reduce the value of me storing carbon in my forests, unlike the pharmaceutical. And the income is coming from conservation. It's linked to conserving the forest, not from exploiting the forest. However, REDD faces some new challenges. So in forest countries, every forest country that would sign up for REDD would have to figure out how to translate this national level income opportunity into local incentives to conserve forests. And within the paying countries, demand has been slower to materialize than many had hoped. So in principle, it's just a simple exchange, dollars for carbon. In practice, with public funds, developed countries have put a variety of co-demands on how to achieve the results or how to spend the money and so forth that have made the process more cumbersome. A 2015 report by my organization, the Center for Global Development, goes into details on challenges with international carbon payments and ways to overcome them. That report is called Look to the Forests. Next slide, please. So stepping back a bit and reflecting on conserving forests for what I term here their instrumental values, their values to people. Of course, forests have many values that people care about for biodiversity or just intrinsically that they're there. And the purpose of valuing services is not to alienate old friends who care very much about biodiversity. Rather, it's to bring in new friends and energize new constituencies, people who care most professionally about health or about energy or about public safety. So when, for example, would forests belong in a hydroelectricity power generation plan? When would they belong in a malaria reduction plan or a coastal protection plan? How to convince people professionally involved in these sectors that forests can serve their interests. One of the ways to do so, I believe, is to communicate in the language or the metric that these sectors are used to dealing with. So dollars per hectare, as we noticed in many of these studies, is a useful number, but it may not be an effective communication number compared to, say, dollars per daily adjusted, disability adjusted life year to health professionals or cents per kilowatt hour to an engineer. A good analog is in climate. People routinely talk about dollars per ton of CO2 to reduce emissions from different sectors, and because deforestation can talk in that metric too, it can easily enter the conversation. Finally, these ways, making forests worth more alive than dead, this should be supplementing and not replacing what I would call restrictive policies. And I'll close with the example of Brazil. This is basically the best thing that's happened, next slide please, the best thing that's happened in tropical forests in the last decade, the best thing that's happened in climate in the last decade. So from 2004 onward, from a peak of nearly 30,000 square kilometers of deforestation a year, Brazil reduced deforestation by nearly 80%, even while cattle and soy production kept going up. It did this by designating many new protected areas throughout the Amazon, by recognizing the claims to land of many indigenous peoples throughout the Amazon, by monitoring deforestation on private land via satellite and then sending out environmental police to catch forest lawbreakers, by cutting off credit to farmers in municipalities that had high deforestation, and through semi-voluntary moratoria within the soy and the beef industries on buying those products from lands that had been deforested. mostly restrictive policies, punitive sticks rather than carrots, but very, very effective. And you can see now that since around 2014, deforestation has been starting to climb back up. So some nervousness, some concern that this success story could be reversed. And so arguably what's needed now for the durability of this success is payments, is some of these making forests worth more alive than dead, and not just punishments. So I think it's important to have both, to have restrictive policies for effectiveness and to combine that with making forests worth more alive than dead with payments to make people better off and to have long-lasting durability. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Jonah. Jenny, if you would go to the next slide, please. So thank you. One more slide, if you don't mind. So participants, this is the time for you to send in your questions. We do have a few that we'll get started with, but we have about 15 minutes for you to ask Jonah any questions about the chapters that he reviewed or about the other chapters that he showed us in one of the earlier slides in the book. So I'm going to start us off with a question that is about Vietnam. So are you aware of the Payments for Forest Ecosystem Services program on a national level in Vietnam? And if yes, can you sort of give us your assessment of it? And sort of regardless of that, yes, what are the shortcomings, the typical shortcomings of these kinds of programs? If you can touch on that.
Yeah. Let's see. So the Vietnam Payment for Ecosystem Services program, I don't think I'm going to be able to know more than the questioner, but there, so I think I'll go instead to the second part of the question, which is about the general shortcomings. And I would add some of the general advantages too. So there's the one that I mentioned, which is just that there's a lot of places where you can't do it because it's unclear who owns the land or has rights to the land, and so it's unclear who would be the people to pay. But now in places where it does take place, one of the trade-offs, I'd say, is having enough money, overall funding for the program, in order to do two things. One is spread the money broadly across many people. The other is to provide a large enough incentive to change people's behavior with respect to clearing forests. And so that often means trying to do some sort of targeting of payments to places where deforestation is highest, or where the value of the forest is greatest, or where the people are poorest and need money the most. And then that can lead into technical challenges and you can second guess whether a good job or a better job could be done. The advantage of payment for ecosystem services is that income is tied to the maintenance of forest. So some other research that I had done, a meta-analysis of what drives and stops deforestation, says that just increasing people's incomes alone in an area does not reduce deforestation there. In fact, it can often increase deforestation as people then have more money to spend on equipment or hire laborers to clear the forest. But if the money is coming in tied to the conservation of the forest, it can increase people's incomes and keep forests standing.
Thank you. I have a question that mentions the funding that Norway has been putting out with $1 billion for Brazil, potential $1 billion for Indonesia, and then certain other amounts promised for Congo and the DRC. Is this sort of impactful? Is this level of funding impactful, or do you think there is a need for more?
Well, yes and yes. So as part of the research for our book, Why Forests, Why Now, my colleagues and I went to Guyana, Brazil, and Indonesia, the three largest recipients of the Norwegian funding, to see how the programs were working. And in Brazil, there was $1 billion agreement, all of which has been paid out by now because Brazil has decreased deforestation by, under the terms of the agreement, much more than even the $1 billion could pay for. Seen as a success. In Guyana, the rates of deforestation there had been very low by world standards, and they remained very, very low by world standards. So under the terms of the agreement, that all the $250 million should have been paid out. They have had a lot of trouble finding a financial intermediary to move the money through, because they don't have something like Brazil has, the BNDES, the National Development Bank, that both sides are confident moving money through. In Indonesia, this we term so far a successful case of non-payment for non-performance. Indonesia's deforestation rates have continued to rise since the agreement was signed, but Norway has not paid any money for reducing deforestation, and the offer stands. That's actually a success when you compare it to other types of bilateral aid funding that have pressure to move money out the door, whether any sort of success was realized or not. So it's I do term these successes, although we get into both the the success stories and the lessons from these in the papers that we wrote on them. In terms of, is more funding needed? Absolutely. And more countries should be, rich countries should be contributing to this type of fund, not just bilaterals, but also through the Green Climate Fund or through the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility, and indeed through markets, through carbon markets, compliance carbon markets, because in Brazil, $1 billion is not very much money compared to the size of the economy. In Indonesia, it's not very much money. In places like Liberia, $1 billion would be an enormous amount of money that could affect behavior. Right now, there's more than 55 tropical forest countries that are in some phase of red readiness, saying yes, they would like to be receiving this type of funding, but so far there's not more than about 7 of those countries that are in the pay-for-performance agreement. So yes, there should be more.
Okay, sort of along similar lines, payments for ecosystem services schemes such as Costa Rica's tend to be priced somewhat arbitrarily, and there's not necessarily an assessment and valuation of the actual ecosystem services being provided by the land or the landowner that's receiving the money. Do you see this as an advantage or a liability to those kinds of programs?
It's a feature. I don't know that it's an advantage or a liability. It's sort of what I was saying before. If you're running one of these programs, you face the choice of giving a lot of money to a few people or a little money to a lot of people, and different countries have approached it differently. So, for example, Ecuador has a Sociobosque program that's more about getting a little money to a lot of people as sort of a greener way to distribute rural welfare payments. I think you're maybe getting to is that mostly this money is much less than the value of the services. If you had more money, you could pay more. One of the interesting programs that you could call it going on is in India, that in 2014 changed the way it pays out its tax revenue to states in a way that includes forest cover, where it never did before. So the central government collects all tax revenue, distributes them to the 30 or so states based on a formula that includes things like area and poverty and income. And just recently it added forest cover. So states that increase their forest cover get more tax revenue, and states that deforest would get less tax revenue. And the incentive there adds up to around $150 per hectare per year to a state, which is really starting to be a substantial amount of money. It's about an order of magnitude higher than the pest programs are paying. But they have there about they project going up to $12 billion a year of money moving this way. The pest programs generally have much smaller budgets.
All right. I'm going to shift gears a little bit to some more data-oriented questions. This person writes, it seems that if there were more data on the value of forest services in a given place, it would be easier to protect that forest. Who are the major players involved with collecting this data? And are rainforest country governments researching this, or is this mainly independent research organizations?
Okay, lots of questions there, and I didn't write them all down, so if I missed something, please remind me. So the data collection is getting easier. For example, I showed at the beginning the map from Hansen and colleagues in Science showing where deforestation has taken place. That kind of scientific and comparable data across space and across time was not available before 3 years ago outside of a few pockets. So having that type of data can really improve valuation studies. There are more people, but you need the science to go with the data. So more studies of how forests affect rainfall and agriculture, affect disease transmission, and so forth. One of the things that we found is that the research is in fact not being done in that many places, and so there are sort of concentrations of places around the tropics where these studies have been done. So for example, a lot from parts of Indonesia, a lot from parts of Brazil, and you can almost say, oh, that's because this is, this professor has a field site there. And so that's why we know so much about this place and so little about other places. So a lot of understudied places as well. Let's see. So like all research, I think there is a heavy slant toward the developed country institutions. There can and should be much more from tropical forest countries themselves. Just to give one example, that study by C4 I showed earlier about how much income comes from tropical forest goods. C4 is in Indonesia, so that's a good start.
Thank you. And just a reminder to participants, I always post a PDF of the presentation in the description of the recording on YouTube, so it's a bit of a layer, but when the recording goes live, you'll be able to reference the citations that Joan is talking about in the presentation. We have time for, I think, one more question, and this one is about how do you avoid double counting while valuing ecosystem services?
All right, so I'm assuming, so this, if I'm interpreting your question right, what this is saying is that if you're adding up different types of ecosystem services, you wouldn't, for example, want to add the value of storing carbon for a cooler climate and the value of harvesting timber, because you know, generally speaking, you can't have both. If you're cutting down the trees for one service, you're losing the value of the other service. So if you added those together, you'd be making a math error. And you know, if you're cognizant of this, it's pretty hard to just, it's pretty easy to just not make that error. I wish I could say that all the researchers do that, but we in fact, you know, do find that some of the most famous, I mean, I think the most famous paper trying to put a number on ecosystem services made exactly this mistake, where they take all the values and they add them up. You know, even when some of them are cutting at cross purposes. But the best studies aren't doing that. So if that's the last question, I would just say thanks to everyone again. As I mentioned, this was a very rapid flyover. You know, there was a lot of nuance I couldn't get into, topics I couldn't get into. We do have much more in the book, Why Forests, Why Now? Thank you.
Thank you, Jonah. And yeah, we have come to the end of our time today. Next slide, please. So I want to thank you for sharing your expertise with our community, and to thank the participants for joining us and sending in your questions. If you have additional questions, you can send them to me and I can pass them along to Jonah. And you'll all receive a follow-up email in a few hours with additional resources that are specific to this webinar. Next slide, please. And if you want to revisit this webinar or share it with colleagues, the recording will be up on the Forest and Climate YouTube channel in about a day or so. You can also find recordings of previous sessions there for additional enrichment. Next slide, please. So thank you all again for joining us, and we hope you have a wonderful day.